Hey there, come closer to the fire for a while, because this story begins at dawn before an old wall, and with a question that has followed us all the way into every modern city. Imagine your hand resting on ancient stone and mud brick, cool before sunrise, rough with the memory of people who lived more than 11,000 years ago. Behind that wall, or beside it, human beings tried something no other generation had ever truly attempted at this scale. They stopped moving. They began to stay. They traded the open horizon for heavy roofs, shared walls, stored grain, buried ancestors, crowding, sickness, arguments, rituals, and a new kind of life that would one day swallow more than half the human world. That is the strange thing. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived by movement. They followed animals, seasons, fruiting trees, rivers, weather, and memory. They carried little, because every extra object had to ride on the back. They slept under temporary shelters, or in caves, or under open sky. They knew how to leave before a place turned against them. Then, almost suddenly in the long story of our species, some people looked at the land and decided to stay. And the darker truth is that staying was not gentle. The first steps towards city life did not make people healthier or happier in any simple way. Their teeth rotted from grain. Their backs bent under repeated labor. Their lungs learned new diseases from smoke and crowding. Their bones began to carry the marks of stress, violence, and malnutrition. Yet they kept building. They kept returning to the same floors. They buried their dead beneath the places where they slept, as if the house itself had become family. Tonight we are going to ask why. Why did humans build the first city if city life nearly destroyed them? If this kind of slow, ancient mystery helps you settle into the night, like this video and subscribe so we can keep walking through old walls together. Now, let the room be quiet for a moment. Let the fire do its small work. We will begin not with kings, because there were no kings yet. Not with palaces, because there were no palaces. Not even with streets, because in one of the strangest early settlements, streets had not been invented in the way we would expect. We begin with a wall. Not because walls are always made for war. That is the mistake. When modern people see an ancient wall, we often imagine enemies, raids, fear, and defense. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes a wall is a raised fist. But the oldest walls may have been stranger than that. They were lines in the earth. They said, "Here is inside. Here is outside. Here is the place where we return. Here is the place where our dead remain. Here is the place where the old wandering life is no longer enough." A wall is not only protection. A wall is a promise. It tells the people who build it that they expect to be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and after the rains, and after the child is born, and after the old woman dies, and after the roof needs repair. A wall is a wager against movement. Once you build it, you have begun to argue with the entire past of your species. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists had a clean story about how this happened. It was simple. and simple stories are comfortable. First came agriculture. People learned to plant. Farming created food surpluses. Surplus allowed some people to stop farming and become specialists. Specialists created trade, craft, ritual, and social classes. Hierarchies built cities. Cities created civilization. It sounds tidy, almost too tidy, like a school diagram with arrows that behave better than humans ever have. Then archaeologists dug deeper, and the neat little ladder began to wobble. Some of the earliest permanent settlements were not full farming villages. Many people were still hunting, gathering, fishing, and harvesting wild grains. Some of the earliest large communities did not have obvious palaces, royal tombs, police, armies, or rulers leaving their names everywhere like cats scratching doorposts. Some had no grand central temple towering over the houses. Some were dense and organized, yet strangely equal in their basic layout. This changed the question. Cities were not only the result of hierarchy. They could also be experiments in cooperation, memory, ritual, storage, and risk. That word matters. Experiment. The first city was not a smaller version of the modern city. It was not a primitive apartment complex waiting politely for plumbing and traffic lights. It was a radical social invention. Humans had no deep instinct for living with thousands of strangers pressed against them. We are not ants. We did not evolve with a neat little program for urban life folded into our bones. We had to improvise, and the improvisation was costly. Today, over half of humanity lives in cities. We treat urban life as normal, even in a Vitabla. People complain about traffic, rond, noise, neighbors, crowded trains, and the price of coffee. Then continue living there because cities hold jobs, culture, medicina, markets, schools, stories, danger, loneliness, and connection all at once. A city is a problem so useful that we keep choosing it. The first people who chose something like it did not know they were beginning that long argument. They only knew that staying had begun to make sense. At first, perhaps, no one called it civilization. No one stood on a roof and announced that humanity had entered a new epoch. More likely, someone noticed that the grain came back in the same valley each year. Someone noticed that the gazelle herds passed through with reliable timing. Someone noticed that a house with stone foundations could survive more than a season. Someone buried a loved one under the floor, and leaving that place became harder. It may have begun with practical things. A storage pit, a grinding stone too heavy to carry, a roof worth repairing, a child born in the same shelter where her grandmother slept. Small things can become chains if they repeat long enough. But chains can also feel like roots. That is the deep confusion at the birth of settlement life. What looks like a trap from one angle looks like belonging from another. A mobile hunter-gatherer might say, "Why would anyone stay where disease gathers and food can fail?" A settled farmer might say, "Why would anyone leave the bones of their family behind?" Both are human. Both are right. The source asks us to remember how long movement had worked. Anatomically modern humans existed for hundreds of thousands of years before cities. For nearly all of that time, people survived by flexibility. If a place dried up, they moved. If herds changed route, they followed. If a camp grew tense, distance could soften conflict. If food vanished, knowledge of a wider landscape saved lives. Movement was not backward. Movement was genius. To travel light is a kind of intelligence. You know the edible roots, the bitter ones, the tracks of animals after rain, the sound of geese before weather shifts, the hill where flint can be found, the hollow where water remains after heat. You know the land as a living map. You do not own it in the later sense. You belong to its changes. Settlement changed that relationship. When people stayed, they began to own memory in one place. A certain wall became the wall where a child scratched a mark. A hearth became the hearth where a grandmother cooked. A floor became the floor under which a brother was buried. A field became not just a patch of plants, but our patch. The land thickened with meaning. This was beautiful. It was also dangerous, because once a place becomes home, leaving it feels like a death. That may be one reason the first city nearly trapped us from the beginning. Not only because agriculture made populations grow beyond what wild food could support, not only because people lost old skills, not only because stored grain, houses, animals, and tools were too heavy to carry. Those things mattered. But the emotional trap mattered too. The ancestors were there. The house was there. The stories were there. The walls held not only people, but identity. If you were standing before the oldest wall at dawn, you might feel that double meaning in the stone. Safety and confinement. Memory and burden. Promise and warning. The old model said humans built cities because progress carried them upward. The bones say something less comfortable. People who moved into early settlements often became shorter. Their diets narrowed. Grain filled the stomach, but did not always nourish the body well. Teeth wore down and decayed. Smoke from hearths filled close rooms. Waste gathered near homes. Animals lived close. Parasites and infections found new opportunities. Violence did not vanish inside walls. Sometimes it moved closer. And still the houses multiplied. Still the walls rose. Still the roofs became pathways. Still the dead were buried under floors. This is why the first city is one of the darkest and most tender stories in human history. It is not a tale of villain. No evil king forced the first roof walkers of Catal Hoyuk to live in a honeycomb of mud brick. No empire commanded the first Natufian people to store grain and honor ancestors under their floors. Much of this came from ordinary people making reasonable decisions in difficult conditions. A little more storage, a stronger house, a little more planting, a few more goats, a few more families nearby. Then, one morning, after many generations, humanity was living in a way the old wandering mind might not recognize. That is how revolutions often happen. Not as thunder, but as habit. The first city began as a series of choices that probably felt practical. It became a new human condition. So tonight, by the fire, we are going to move slowly backward. Before the dense roofs of Catal Hoyuk, before the strange houses without doors, before the bull horns in plaster and the vulture paintings and the bones beneath sleeping platforms, before the sick teeth and worn knees and healed skull fractures, before the beautiful trap, we return to the open world. 15,000 years ago, the Ice Age was loosening its grip. The Fertile Crescent was not yet the dry landscape many imagine today. It was greener, veta, richer, filled with wild grains and animals beyond counting. Humans moved through it lightly, as they had always moved. And for a while, nature made staying seem almost harmless. The fire gives a small sound. The wall fades. The open plain returns. And in that plain, before the first city, before the first trap, there was abundance enough to make people believe that maybe, just maybe, they no longer needed to wander. Before there were walls, there was movement. Not wandering in the foolish sense. Not lost people drifting because they did not know how to stay. Movement was knowledge. Movement was memory held in the feet. A family knew where the gazelles crossed after rain, where pistachio trees gave best in a warm year, where wild barley ripened first, where flint could be found, where water remained in a hollow after the heat had emptied smaller streams. 15,000 years ago, the last ice age was beginning to loosen its grip on the world. Great ice sheets far to the north were retreating. The air shifted. Rainfall changed. The region we now call the Fertile Crescent became a place of astonishing abundance, not the dry image many people carry in their minds today, but a green and generous arc of hills, valleys, rivers, and open country. It was not paradise in a simple way. Nature never is. There were predators, accidents, hunger in bad seasons, infections, grief, and storms. But compared with the harsher cold that had come before, this warming world must have felt like a gift spread across the land. Wild wheat grew in thick stands. Barley and rye moved across hillsides. Grasses rose chest-high in some places, heavy with seed heads that could be cut, gathered, dried, and stored. Gazelle herds passed through predictable routes, sometimes in numbers so large that the ground seemed to move with them. Wild cattle, deer, onagers, sheep, goats, fish, birds, and small game filled the seasonal calendar with opportunity. For people who knew how to read such a world, the land was not empty. It was a book. A band might number 25 to 50 people, perhaps a few extended families, children, adults, elders who carried stories and practical knowledge in equal measure. The group moved lightly. Tools were stone, bone, wood, hide, fiber. A grinding stone could be useful, but also heavy, and heavy things ask dangerous questions when you live by walking. Everything had to earn its place. A shelter could be raised from branches, reeds, hide, or brush, then left behind when the season turned. The home was not one building. The home was a pattern across the landscape a winter valley, a spring riverbank, a summer high place, a route of ancestors whose footsteps remained in memory even when no wall marked them. Then the land began to say, "Stay." Not everywhere, not all at once, but in certain valleys, certain rich zone, certain places where wild grain returned reliably and animals crossed with almost calendar precision. People could remain longer without starving. At first, perhaps they stayed for a season, then a longer season. Then they returned to the same place year after year. Then someone built a stronger wall around a shelter, because why rebuild everything from nothing if you know you will come back? Archaeologists call these semi-permanent camps. The phrase is tidy, and it does its job, but it does not quite hold the emotional size of the change. A semi-permanent camp was a crack in 200,000 years of habit. It was the first serious bet that one place could hold enough life. Stone foundations appear, timber frames, storage pits, heavier grinding stones, objects too awkward for constant travel. The moment a household owns something it cannot easily carry, the world changes. A grinding stone left behind says, "We will return." A storage pit says, "The future can be held here." A house foundation says, "This place is not only where we sleep tonight, it is where our memory is beginning to gather." Possessions multiplied because staying made them useful. A mobile life punishes accumulation. A settled life rewards it. A heavy stone bowl, a decorated object, a cache of seeds, a set of tools, all become possible when the house waits. People began to store food and store meaning in the same places. The dead changed too. When a band is mobile, burial can still be sacred, but the grave may remain behind. When people settle, the dead stay close. Some early communities buried people under floors or near houses. Later, skulls were sometimes removed, plastered, painted, and kept where the living could see them. The ancestor was not distant. The ancestor was underfoot, in the wall, in the room, part of the house breath. This might sound eerie to us. To them, it may have felt like comfort. Your dead were not gone into some far field. They remained near the hearth. They were present in the place where children played and adults ate. A house became a family across time, not only across space. For a long time, this system worked. The Natufian world, as archaeologists name it, was not farming yet, at least not fully. People still hunted and gathered, but they were managing the wild. They may have protected stands of grain, harvested heavily in places that returned well, stored seeds, and watched animals. They were no longer simply taking what nature gave at random. They were entering into a more demanding relationship with the land. Then the climate turned. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas began. The name is soft, almost pretty, named after a little flowering plant. But the event was brutal. Across much of the northern hemisphere, temperatures dropped sharply. The cause is still debated. Some scientists point to meltwater disrupting ocean currents. Others have proposed impact events, volcanism, or complex climate feedbacks. We cannot reduce it to one easy answer. But for the people of the Fertile Crescent, the effect mattered more than the cause. Imagine the fear of that slowly arriving. Not one bad day, not one failed hunt. A pattern. The hillside that once shimmered with grain now gives less. The herd that always came through the valley comes thin, or lot, or not at all. A storage pit empties too quickly. Elders argue quietly. Young people look toward other valleys. Children still ask for food in the same voices as before. For people who had grown attached to particular places, this was devastating. Some communities left. They returned to movement, the ancient strategy. If one place no longer gives enough, go elsewhere. That had saved humans for countless generations. Mobility spreads risk. It keeps the body from being trapped inside one failing landscape. But some groups did not leave. Maybe they refused. Maybe they could not. After generations in one place, the old mobile knowledge may have weakened. Not vanished completely, but thinned. A person raised beside storage pits and house floors knows different things than a person raised to read a 100-mile route. There were ancestors in the ground now. Heavy tools. Stored food. Ritual places. Children who knew the settlement as home. To leave was not only to move. It was to tear memory from the earth. So some groups tried another answer. If wild grain no longer came thick enough, plant it. If animals no longer arrived when needed, keep some close. If nature no longer provided abundance freely, force the land to give more predictably. This was not agriculture as a cheerful invention. It was not a group of happy geniuses one morning deciding that farming sounded like a relaxing hobby. The first cultivation was probably desperate, experimental, uneven, and exhausting. At first, the results were not impressive by later standards. Early cultivated grains were not necessarily more nutritious than wild foods. Early domestic animals were not docile little farm friends. They were difficult, skravne, nervous, and inconvenient. But they had one powerful advantage: reliability. A wild herd might fail to pass. A planted field, if rains came and labor continued, might return. A captive animal might be troublesome, but it was there. Reliability can feel like salvation during crisis, and it can become a trap. Over centuries, humans changed plants and animals, and plants and animals changed humans. Wheat and barley developed larger seeds and traits that made harvesting easier. Sheep and goats became more manageable. Human diets shifted toward starch. Bodies adapted in some ways and suffered in others. Agriculture was a long conversation between hunger, labor, seed, animal, climate, and memory. By the time the Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, warmth returned. But people had changed. They had learned to produce food. They had learned to store more. They had learned to live with heavier tools, more possessions, more permanent houses, more ancestors under floors. The old door, back to full mobility, was not closed everywhere. But for many communities, it had become harder to open. Small farming villages spread. Populations grew. A band of 25 to 50 became a settlement of 100, then 200. Kinship could still hold such places together. Everyone might know everyone else. Marriage, family, obligation, gossip, and tradition kept order. But growth has a way of asking for new forms. More people meant more food. More food meant more labor. More labor meant more coordination. More coordination meant more rules. And one day, in south-central Anatolia, on a mound that would later sleep beneath Turkish fields, people attempted something much larger than a village. Catal Hoyuk, a settlement so dense and strange that when archaeologists uncovered it, they struggled to decide what to call it. Not a city in the later sense, with streets, palaces, gates, and written records. Not a village in the ordinary sense, because it was too vast, too dense, too organized, too persistent. A roof city, a honeycomb of houses, thousands of people living pressed together, entering their homes from above, walking across one another's roofs, burying their dead beneath their sleeping platforms, painting wild animals on plaster walls, making obsidian tools, weaving cloth, trading, feasting, arguing, healing, coughing, grinding grain, and somehow continuing for more than 1,000 years. The path from Natufian abundance to Catal Hoyuk was not straight. It passed through cold, hunger, invasion, loss, and stubbornness. That is why the first city feels so human. It was born from people trying to solve one problem, then discovering they had created another. They wanted reliability and received labor. They wanted home and received confinement. They wanted storage and received dependence. They wanted ancestors near and received floors heavy with the dead. The fire beside us is quiet now. The open plain begins to fade. The wild grain bends in the ancient wind. The younger dryas cold passes like a shadow across the hills. And ahead, on a mound in Anatolia, ladders are rising through roof holes. Smoke is lifting from hearths, and humanity is about to climb down into the dark rooms of its first great urban experiment. The mound of Catal Hoyuk rises gently from the plain, not like a castle, not like a pyramid, but like a sleeping memory under fields. Today it sits in south-central Turkey, quiet under sky and wind, with wheat and dry grass around it, with the distant shape of Hasan Dağ on the horizon, a volcano that once gave the people black glass from the earth. But around 7100 before the Common Era, this place was alive with footsteps, smoke, voices, ladders, roofs, hearths, burials, and the constant soft pressure of thousands of people living so close together that privacy itself must have been a rare animal. Archaeologists struggled with what to call it. A village feels too small. A city feels too modern. A town feels too polite. Catal Hoyuk was something stranger. A vast settlement made of mud brick houses pressed wall to wall, built and rebuilt across generations until the mound rose from its own past. It did not have streets in the way we expect. It did not have broad avenues, market squares, palace gates, or a king carved proudly into stone. It did not greet the archaeologist with a neat plan and a helpful sign saying, "Here is the palace. Here is the temple. Here is the poor quarter. Here is the rich quarter." It greeted them with houses. House beside house. Room beside room. Wall against wall. A honeycomb of human staying. When James Mellart began excavating there in 1958, the site changed the way people imagine the birth of cities. Beneath the Turkish soil, he found not a small cluster of huts, but a dense mass of buildings, packed tightly, repeated over time, with plastered walls, platforms, hearths, ovens, storage spaces, paintings, burials, and objects placed with care. Later, archaeological teams continued the work with new methods, slower tools, more cautious interpretations, and the kind of patience that ancient houses require if they are not to be misunderstood. The first surprise was density. Catal Hoyuk may have held 5,000 to 10,000 people at its height, depending on the estimate. Even the lower number is astonishing for the time. Imagine 5,000 people in a world without writing, without metal tools, without formal money, without wheeled carts, without obvious kings, without police, without streets on the ground. 5,000 people sharing a built environment so dense that the houses leaned into one another like tired relatives. To live there was to live inside closeness. A child crying through a wall. A neighbor grinding grain before dawn. A ladder creaking overhead. Smoke moving from one roof to another. Feet crossing the roof above your sleeping space. A whispered argument too near to ignore. Someone laughing while you are trying to rest. Someone cooking while your own stomach is still empty. The old mobile life had offered distance when tension grew. Catal Hoyuk offered walls. Thin walls. Shared walls. Walls that remembered every voice. And yet the settlement endured for more than 1,000 years. This was not a failed camp that collapsed after one generation. It was a long-lived system. Houses were demolished and rebuilt on the same footprints. Floors were replastered. Walls were renewed. Ancestors remained under platforms. The same spaces were cared for across lifetimes, as if each house had a biography. The source calls it an experiment, and that is the right word. Not because the people were scientists in white coats. Of course, they were living through a social experiment with no instruction manual. How do thousands of people share space without streets? How do families keep identity when every house touches another? How do you manage waste, smoke, food, death, arguments, children, trade, and ritual, and memory when everyone is pressed into a mud brick hive? The answer was rooftops. At Catal Hoyuk. The roofs were the streets. That simple sentence is one of the strangest in early urban archaeology. Many houses had no ground-level doors. People entered from above, through roof openings, using ladders. The roofs connected the settlement into a raised landscape. A person moving through the community might cross one roof, then another, then another, stepping over stored items, passing smoke holes, hearing voices rising from below. The public world was above the private world. Imagine the city from the air at dawn. Hundreds of flat roofs, patched and replastered, pale in the early light. Thin smoke lifting from roof openings. Ladders leaning into dark interiors. People emerging one by one, carrying baskets. Children, water containers, tools, grain, gossip, quenelle. A woman looks across several roofs and sees a relative waving. A child runs too quickly and is scolded before reaching the next roof edge. Someone carries fuel. Someone shakes dust from a mat. There are no streets below, because below is mostly interior. The city turns itself inside out, or perhaps upside down. It is both funny and eerie. If a modern person woke there and tried to go outside through the front door, he might spend a very confused morning staring at walls. The exit is above you. The neighbor is above you. The city is above you. Up the ladder you go, like a human chimney with breakfast plans. But this arrangement was practical. Shared walls saved building material. Dense packing may have helped regulate temperature, protecting against heat and cold. Roof movement created, controlled access. A house could be entered only from above, and a ladder could be removed if necessary. In a place without streets, the paths of movement were visible to everyone. Privacy was limited, but so was hidden intrusion. The standard house had a main room with platforms, pizza hearth, an oven, storage bins, and smaller side spaces. Walls were often plastered white, sometimes again and again, layer upon layer, like skin renewed over time. Floors, too, were replastered. The interior could be clean, bright in firelight, and carefully maintained. These were not crude shelters. They were meaningful spaces, built with repeated attention. The platforms mattered. People slept on them, worked on them, sat on them, buried their dead beneath them. A platform was not merely furniture, because the boundary between furniture, floor, bed, altar, memory, and grave did not work there the way it works in a modern room. A child might sleep above the bones of a grandparent. Food might be prepared a few steps from a burial. A painted wall might look down over daily chores and ancestral presence. The house was a body of memory. Each generation rebuilt the house over the earlier one, sometimes preserving the layout, sometimes closing rooms, sometimes raising new walls on old foundations. The mound grew from this repetition. Catal Hoyuk was made of houses standing on houses, lives placed over lives, floors resting on earlier floors. The city rose because people kept choosing the same place again. There is deep comfort in that. There is also deep weight. To inherit a house, there was not only to inherit shelter, it was to inherit the dead beneath it, the paintings on the walls, the old repairs, the storage spaces, the rights and obligations connected to that household. You belonged to a place, and the place belonged to a chain of remembered people. That chain could hold you close. It could also hold you still. The settlement shows signs of craft and exchange. obsidian from nearby volcanic sources was shaped into sharp blades, scrapers, and tools. Obsidian is beautiful in the hand, black and glossy, sharp enough to cut with a whisper. It was valuable, useful, and traded across distances. Catal Hoyuk sat near access to this important material, which may have helped support its size and connections. Inside and on the roofs, people worked. They ground grain. They prepared food. They made baskets. They shaped bone tools. They wove textiles. They repaired walls. They tended animals. They hunted wild cattle and other animals. They made beads, figurines, pigmon, and plaster. Work was everywhere, but not all work was the same. Some households may have specialized in particular crafts, while exchanging goods and services through kinship, obligation, reputation, and reciprocity rather than through coins or formal markets. Perhaps the city was governed through memory, through households, through ritual, through gossip, through shared access across roofs, through the knowledge that everyone could see who carried what, who visited whom, who failed to join a feast, who neglected a wall, who dishonored the dead, who behaved badly in a place with very few hiding places. In modern terms, we might call it social surveillance. In simple human terms, we might call it neighbors. And neighbors, as every age has discovered, can be more powerful than police when they know too much and sleep 2 walls away. This is part of what allowed Catal Hoyuk to function without streets and kings. The city did not need a palace if order lived in every household. It did not need a central temple if ritual lived in ordinary rooms. It did not need a visible ruler if identity and obligation were anchored in houses, ancestors, shared roofs, and daily dependence. The first great urban experiment was not a miniature version of later Mesopotamian city-states. It was its own answer. Not palace first, not street first, not king first, house first, roof first, ancestor first, shared wall first. And that answer worked for a very long time. At evening, the rooftops would glow. The sun would lower over the plain. Smoke would drift upward from openings. People would finish tasks, carry food, call children back from the roof edges, lower themselves through hatches into warm rooms below. The mound would become quieter, but never completely silent. Under the floors, ancestors rested. In the walls, bull horns waited. On plaster, wild animals held their painted stillness. The first city was not yet only the dark place of disease and worn teeth that the bones will later reveal. It was also home. It was laughter. It was bread. It was skill. It was the comfort of a ladder placed exactly where you expected it at the end of a long day. That is why people stayed. Not only because they were trapped, because the trap had a hearth. The fire beside us softens now, and the aerial view of the roof city begins to lower. We have looked down at Catal Hoyuk from above, at its honeycomb roofs and crowded walls. Now we descend through a roof hatch into the dark warmth of one house, where smoke lingers near the ceiling. The plaster glows faintly, A grinding stone waits beside stored grain, and the bones of the dead lie quietly beneath the living floor. The house is dark before dawn. Not empty dark, not frightening dark, but the warm, enclosed dark of a room that has held sleeping bodies through the night. The hearth has fallen low. A red coal rests under gray ash. Smoke clings near the roof opening, thin and stale, carrying the smell of yesterday food. Burned dung, wood, plasta dust, and human breath. Somewhere nearby, a child turns in sleep. Someone coughs softly. A mat rustles. The walls are pale, with many layers of white plaster, though in the dimness they look gray and almost alive. There is no front door. That is the first thing a modern visitor must remember. You do not walk out into a street. You climb. A ladder stands beneath the roof hatch, its rungs worn by hands and feet. Above it, the opening is still dark, but cooler air slips down from the roof. The house waits for morning from above. The sleeping platforms along the walls hold bodies wrapped in skins, woven mats, or cloth. Beneath some of those platforms lie the dead, folded into the house, not far away in a cemetery beyond the settlement, but here, under the place where the living rest. Imagine waking above your ancestors. Your foot touches the floor. The plaster is cool. Beneath it, below a thin sealed layer of earth and memory, are bones wrapped long ago in reed matting. Perhaps a mother, a child, an elder, someone whose face was known, whose voice once filled the room. The house is not only shelter, it is a layered family. To rise in the morning is to rise above the past. A woman stirs the hearth. Or a man? The evidence at Catal Hoyuk does not make the daily tasks fall into perfectly simple categories. There was division of labor, but not always in the rigid way later societies would insist upon. In a house like this, everyone who could work probably worked. Grain needed grinding. Fuel needed gathering. Water needed carrying. Walls needed repair. Children needed attention. Tools needed sharpening. Fires needed watching. Life is not shy about making lists. The coal is coaxed back into flame. A little fuel is added. The smell changes. Heat returns slowly, first as a faint glow, then a small pulse of light licking the curved inside of the hearth. Shadows move across the plaster. The room reveals itself by degrees. Storage bins along one wall. A small oven. Platforms. Baskets. Tools. A grinding stone. Perhaps a painted design, or a wall relief, or the dark curve of a bullhorn set into plaster. The bullhorn waits in the half-light like a memory of wild strength. Outside, the roof city begins to wake. Feet cross above. Not loudly at first. A single step. Then another. Someone moves across the roof, carrying something heavy enough to make a soft thud overhead. A ladder creaks in a nearby house. A child calls out and is hushed. Smoke rises from another opening and drifts sideways in the dawn air. Inside, someone climbs the ladder. Hand on rung. Foot searching. body lifting through the roof hole into the morning. The air above is colder, fresher, and full of small movement. The eastern light touches the roofs, one after another. Catal Hoyuk appears from roof level, not as streets and buildings, but as a broad raised landscape of mud brick, plaster, smoke holes, ladders, baskets, tools, stored fuel, and people stepping carefully between household worlds. The rooftops are streets. A person can move across the settlement from roof to roof, passing over the private rooms below. There are paths, but not paved avenues. There is order, but not street signs. The path is learned by use. A child knows which roof belongs to a friendly ant, which edge to avoid, which hatch not to approach without calling first, which household smells of fresh bread, which roof has a loose patch of plaster that adults complain about every week. The morning sounds gather. Grinding begins. That sound may be one of the deepest rhythms of early settled life. Stone against grain. Push, drag, scrape, repeat. Wild seeds and cultivated grains must be processed before they become food. The work can last for hours. It wears the arms, knees, back, and teeth of a life. A grinding stone is useful, but it is also a little tyrant. Once grain becomes central to diet, the stone demands attention every day. In one house, grain is poured from storage. In another, flour is sifted or mixed. Somewhere, bread or porridge is prepared. The smell moves upward through roof openings, warm, earthy, and comforting. Wheat and barley filled the stomach and helped sustain the city. They also brought dental decay, nutritional narrowing, repetitive labor, and dependence. But in the morning, when hunger is ordinary and children are waiting, such future costs are not the first thought. Food is food. The body asks before philosophy speaks. The roof traffic thickens. A woman carries a basket. A man carries a toolkit. A child tries to follow an older sibling and is told not to step there. Someone passes water in a container. Someone gossips from one roof to another. Gossip is not a small thing in a place like this. It is social glue, social warning, social entertainment, and social court. In a settlement without obvious kings, words moving across roofs may have helped hold order. You know that feeling when neighbors notice everything? Catal Hoyuk may have turned that into an urban system. Everyone was visible much of the time. Roof movement exposed patterns. Who visited whose house? Who exchanged goods? Who failed to help? Who hosted a feast? Who seemed ill? Who argued? Who neglected ritual obligations? In such a world, privacy existed, but thinly. Social pressure could move like smoke, entering every opening. Yet this closeness also meant help. If a roof needed repair, neighbors could assist. If a child cried, nearby kin heard. If sickness entered a house, others noticed. If a feast was held, food and meaning spread outward. A dense city can suffocate, but it can also catch you before you fall. The daily work spreads through the settlement. Obsidian is struck in one household or on a working surface nearby. The sound is sharp and bright, a quick crack like ice breaking under a careful hand. Obsidian from volcanic sources near Hassan Dag arrives as nodules or rough material, then becomes blades, flakes, scrapers, points, and cutting tools. It is black glass born from fire under the earth, glossy enough to catch the light, sharp enough to make a careless person regret daydreaming. A craftsperson sits with practiced patience. Stone core in hand, hammerstone ready, angle judged by memory. A strike. A blade flakes away. Another strike. A smaller tool. The hands know what the eyes have learned over years. This is not crude work. It is precision. A good obsidian blade can travel far beyond the settlement through exchange networks, linking Catal Hoyuk to other communities across the landscape. Animals move at the edges of the settlement and sometimes within its rhythms. Sheep and goats are increasingly managed. Wild cattle remain symbolically powerful and dangerous. Hunting still matters, not only for meat, but for prestige, ritual, memory, and connection with the wild world beyond the houses. The people of Catal Hoyuk were not simply farmers sealed away from nature. They lived in a tension between cultivation and wildness. Their walls held them, but their art kept animals close. Inside the house, the day turns. Children eat. Adults work. Someone repairs plaster on a wall. Plastering is not glamorous, but it is one of the great acts of settled life. Mud brick and plaster require maintenance. Surfaces crack. Smoke stains. Dust gathers. A house stays clean and meaningful only if people return again and again with wet plaster, smoothing, patching, renewing. The walls of some houses received many layers over time, as if the room kept growing new skin. There may be art on the walls. At some point, a burial may happen. Not every day, of course. But death is part of the house story. A body may be wrapped in a reed mat, flexed, and placed beneath a platform. The floor is opened carefully. Earth is removed. The wrapped body is lowered into the place prepared. Perhaps older burials are near. Perhaps some bones are moved. Practices varied, and we should not pretend more certainty than the evidence allows. But the broad fact remains. The dead are inside. For us, the idea may feel uneasy. To sleep above burials sounds haunted. To them, it may have been intimate, protective, and correct. The dead held the house in time. They helped make a claim to place. They reminded the living that the house was not temporary. You did not belong there only because you slept there tonight. You belonged because your people had been placed beneath it. The floor is sealed again. The surface is smoothed. Life continues. That is perhaps the most human part. After death, someone still has to cook. Someone still has to grind grain. Someone still has to mend a basket, soothe a child, check a roof edge, and borrow a tool. Grief and chores have always lived in the same house. As evening comes, the settlement lifts itself back toward the roofs. The day heat fades. People climb up for cooler air. Smoke rises more thickly as hearths are lit. The distant volcano darkens on the horizon. Birds pass. The plain beyond the settlement stretches wide, holding wild animals, fields, water sources, paths, and dangers. From above, the city seems both secure and vulnerable, a cluster of human warmth inside a world still much larger than it. Inside the houses, fires glow. The plaster walls receive the light. Bull horns cast long shadows. Children grow sleepy. Someone tells a story, perhaps of a hunt, an ancestor, a strange animal, a dream, a sickness survived, a house rebuilt. Maybe someone makes a joke about a neighbor who always walks too heavily across the roof. Even early cities needed small comedy, because without it, shared walls would become unbearable. Night settles. Un by un, people descend through roof openings into their homes. Ladders creak. Smoke hovers. Food is eaten. Tools are set aside. Bodies return to platforms above the dead. The city quiets, but never fully. A cough here. A baby there. A soft argument through plaster. A dog stirring. A late footstep crossing a roof. This is Catal Hoyuk as lived life. Not merely an archaeological plan. Not merely a theory about urban origins. A place where someone woke hungry, worked hard, laughed once, worried over a child, repaired a wall, honored a burial, smelled bread, heard gossip, and slept under a roof that was also a street. The first city was not only a beautiful trap, it was home. And because it was home, people stayed long enough for its walls to fill with symbols. Animals, schools, horns, and mysteries that still refuse to answer us clearly. At Catal Hoyuk, the sacred did not live in one separate building. That may be one of the strangest discoveries of the site. When archaeologists first imagined early religion, many expected a temple, a central shrine, a special house standing apart from the ordinary rooms, somewhere priests might have gathered while everyone else stayed outside. Catal Hoyuk does not separate so easily. The sacred seems to be everywhere. In the house, in the wall, under the floor, in the hearth smoke, in the painted animal, in the plastered surface, renewed again and again, in the bones below the sleeping platform, in the roof path where daily footsteps crossed above the dead. The people did not build one great temple above the settlement. They made ordinary houses carry extraordinary meanings. That is why the houses feel so intimate and so unsettling. A home could be a kitchen, a bedroom, a workshop, a burial chamber, a memory room, and a shrine all at once. A child might eat bread beside a wall where horns of a wild bull rose from plaster. An adult might grind grain in a room where painted leopards seemed to watch. A family might sleep above ancestors, and in the morning climb through the roof into the city light. The old boundary between daily life and ritual had not hardened yet. Maybe that was the point. In Catal Hoyuk, life was not divided into sacred time and ordinary time. The house itself was the place where birth, food, work, memory, death, animal power, and ancestor presence met. If you lived there, your walls were not just walls. They were a conversation with everything your family feared and needed. The bull horns are among the most powerful signs. Real horns and bull skulls were set into walls, benches, and platforms. The wild bull was not a domestic cow standing politely in a field. It was strength, danger, male force, meat, risk, and wildness. To hunt such an animal required courage and coordination. To bring its horns into the house was to bring danger indoors, but under control. Imagine one of those rooms by firelight. The hearth burns low. Smoke bends upward toward the roof opening. The white plaster glows orange. On the wall, the dark curve of bull horns throws a shadow larger than the room itself. The family sits beneath them, eating, talking, maybe laughing softly, while the old wild power hangs over daily life like a memory that has not been tamed entirely. A horn in a wall is not decoration in the modern sense. It is a statement. The wild is inside the house now. The danger is remembered. The animal that once stood beyond the settlement has been brought into the human room, not as meat only, but as presence. Still, the emotional force is clear. The people of Catal Hoyuk lived between two worlds. They were settling, farming, grinding grain, tending houses, burying family under floors. Yet their art and ritual kept returning to wild animals, bulls, leopards, vulturas, and creatures that belonged beyond human walls. It is as if the first city needed the wild close by, perhaps because it feared losing it. The leopard images are especially haunting. Some paintings show pairs of leopards, patterned bodies stretched across walls, their forms repeated with care. Leopards were beautiful and dangerous. They moved silently. They saw in darkness. They were not animals of the hearth. To paint them inside the house may have been protection, admiration, fear, memory, or a way of borrowing their power. By firelight, a painted leopard would not stay perfectly still. Flames make walls breathe. The spots would shift. The back would seem to lengthen. Vultures appear too. This may be even stranger to us. Vultures in some wall paintings are shown near headless human figures, and scholars have debated what such scenes mean. They may connect with death rituals, sky burial, the separation of flesh and bone, the journey of the soul, or symbolic transformations we no longer fully understand. Some suggest that bodies may have been exposed before selected bones were gathered and buried under houses. Others are cautious, because evidence is complex and interpretation is difficult. The image remains. A vulture in the sky, a human body below, the living house waiting to receive the bones. To modern eyes, this can feel dark, but death rituals often look unsettling from outside. From inside, they may be acts of love. If the people of Catal Hoyuk allowed birds, time, or the open air to transform the dead before bringing them home, then the process may have connected sky, body, ancestor, and house. The dead did not vanish. They changed form and returned. That return is important. Ancestor treatments connected with the wider Neolithic world show that the head could be preserved, shaped, painted, and kept as a powerful object of memory. At Catal Hoyuk, burials beneath floors and selected handling of remains suggest that ancestors were not passive. They were part of household identity. A house could hold its dead the way a tree holds rings. The source frames this as a refusal to let the dead disappear. That phrase is worth keeping. The first city did not only store grain. It stored people. It stored memory in bone, wall, plaster, and repeated house rebuilding. The dead gave weight to place. They made leaving harder. They made belonging stronger. A person did not only live in a house. A person lived inside a lineage of rooms. Then there is the seated woman figurine. For many years, such figures were interpreted as mother goddesses, signs of fertility, abundance, and female divinity. The famous seated woman from Catal Hoyuk, large-bodied and flanked by animals in some interpretations, seemed to support that image. She looked powerful, grounded, full, almost enthroned. It was tempting to see in her the great mother of the first city. Modern scholars are more cautious. Figurines may have had many uses. Some could be ritual objects, some teaching tools, some toys, some magical items, some images of ancestors, some things whose meanings changed from house to house or moment to moment. A figurine found in one context does not automatically reveal a goddess, no matter how much the modern imagination wants one. This caution does not empty the figure. It makes her more mysterious. Imagine holding a small clay figurine in the palm. It is not heavy, but it has presence. A thumb once smoothed it. A nail perhaps marked it. Someone shaped a body from clay and kept it long enough for us to find. We do not know. That is frustrating. It is also beautiful. The first city keeps some of its secrets because not every meaning survives as a fact. Ritual feasting may have been another way the settlement held itself together. Animal bones, special rooms, deposits, and evidence of repeated practices suggest gatherings where food, perhaps meat from dangerous wild cattle or other animals, was shared in ways that carried social meaning. A feast is never only about calories. It is about who is invited, who gives, who receives, who watches, who is remembered, who is left out. In a dense settlement with no obvious palace, feasting could create authority without a throne. A household that hosted well gained prestige. A lineage that remembered the right rites held power. A group that controlled access to certain rituals could shape social life without needing a crown or written law. Think of a night feast. Smoke thick in a room. Meat cooking. Grain porridge stirred. People close together, knees almost touching. Voices low because the room is full and heat presses against the plaster. Someone chants or tells a story. Someone passes food. Someone gestures toward horns in the wall, or toward a painted animal, or toward the floor where ancestors lie. Children watch from the edge, trying to understand which parts are serious and which parts are adults making more mystery than necessary. They learn when to be silent. They learn which house has power. They learn which animal matters. They learn that food and memory and fear belong together. They learn the city through ritual before they can explain it. Some scholars have suggested shamanic elements at Catal Hoyuk, altered states, animal transformation, journeys between worlds. Such ideas must be handled carefully. It is easy to project modern fantasies onto ancient images. But the wall paintings, animal forms, body treatments, and charged domestic spaces do suggest a world where boundaries were porous. Human and animal, living and dead, house and shrine, roof and sky, all touched each other. This was not religion separated from life. It was life thick with presence. The people of Catal Hoyuk were controlling nature more than their ancestors had. They stored grain. They managed animals. They built dense houses. They stayed. Yet their walls were filled with wild power. Bulls, leopards, vulturas. The city domesticated life, but the imagination kept opening the door to the wild. Perhaps that was necessary. To become settled is to lose something. You gain security, memory, storage, neighbors, ritual depth, and a hearth that waits for you. But you lose some of the old freedom. You no longer wake each season under a different sky. You no longer travel lightly. You become responsible to walls, floors, grand bains, and ancestors under your feet. The wild animals on the walls may have been reminders of what had been given up, or guardians of what had not yet been fully lost. That is the psychological beauty of Catal Hoyuk. The first city did not simply defeat nature. It brought nature inside and lived with its shadows. The bullhorns in plaster said, "Danger remains." The vultures said, "Death transforms." The leopard said, "The night still watches." The skulls beneath floors said, "Memory holds." The figurine said, "Form can carry meaning, even when meaning escapes us." By late evening, the house would glow with these things. The plaster walls no longer plain, but alive in firelight. The hearth breathing. The roof opening dark above. A ladder ready. The dead below. The wild on the wall. The living between them. Eating, sleeping, worrying, loving, repairing, remembering. It is tender. It is eerie. It is home. And it prepares us for the bones. Because behind the painted animals and the ritual warmth, the bodies of Catal Hoyuk began to record another story. Teeth decayed. Lungs suffered. Parasites moved silently. Skulls healed from blows. Knees and backs wore down from repeated work. The first city did not only fill walls with symbols, it wrote its cost into the people who lived inside it. The bones of Catal Hoyuk speak more quietly than the painted walls. They do not glow by firelight. They do not show leopards, vulturas, bull horns, or mysterious figures shaped from clay. They rest in drawers, trays, museum stores, excavation records, and careful reports. A tooth here, a skull there, a femur worn by use, a spine bent by labor, a jaw with decay deep enough to make even a modern dentist wince in sympathy. The first city wrote itself into bodies. That is the truth waiting beneath the plaster. At first, grain looks like a miracle. It can be gathered, stored, counted, ground, baked, and shared. It lets people remain in one place. It feeds children through poor hunting days. It gives a household something to hold against the future. A storage bin full of grain is a promise that tomorrow may not be empty. But grain also changes the mouth. Teeth from early settled communities often show more decay than those of many mobile foragers. Sticky carbohydrates cling to teeth. Ground grain carries grit from stone grinding, wearing enamel down. Cavities open. Abscesses form. Infection can travel into bone. Pain becomes part of daily life. Imagine a woman grinding grain at dawn. Her hands move the stone forward and back. The rhythm is familiar, almost calming if heard from across the room. But inside her wrists and shoulders the work accumulates. Flour dust rises. Tiny grit from the stone mixes with the meal. Lauter, bread, fills the stomach, warm and useful, but each bite carries the slow future of worn molars. The city is fed, and the teeth pay quietly. A toothache in a world without modern dentistry is not a small inconvenience. It is a hidden fire. It changes how a person chews, sleeps, speaks, works. It makes patience thinner. It makes ritual harder to enjoy. It makes a child cry and an adult sit very still with one hand against the jaw, waiting for pain to loosen its grip. When archaeologists find abscesses in ancient jaws, they are not only finding pathology, they are finding nights without comfort. Then there is smoke. Catal Hoyuk houses had hearths and ovens inside rooms entered from the roof. Smoke could escape through openings, but it did not vanish neatly. It lingered. It stained plaster. It entered eyes, throats, lungs, cloth, hair, and sleeping mats. In cold or wet conditions, people remained inside with fire because warmth and cooking mattered more than clear air. Every hearth was comfort and hazard together. A city of roof houses was also a city of shared breath. Crowding matters. In mobile bands, disease could burn out because people were fewer and more spread across landscapes. In dense settlements, infection found new paths. People lived close to one another, close to waste, close to animals, close to stored food that invited pests. A cough in one house could become a cough in another. A child with fever was not isolated in a distant valley. He was above, below, beside, and across from others. Tuberculosis has been discussed in connection with early dense communities, and Catal Hoyuk shows evidence that some infectious diseases found opportunity there. The details are complex, and scholars debate specific diagnoses. But the broader pattern is clear. Settled life gave pathogens new homes. The walls held people. They also held microbes. Parasites entered too. Waste disposal in a dense settlement is never a small problem. Without modern sanitation, human waste, animal waste, water sources, insects, and food storage can become a quiet network of contamination. Parasites do not need kings or armies. They need habits. They need proximity. They need a pathway from one body to another. Early urban life gave them many. The bodies show stress. Some skeletons suggest nutritional strain. A grain-heavy diet can fill the belly while narrowing the range of nutrients. Harvest failure becomes more dangerous once a community depends heavily on crops. Mobility once allowed for a wide menu across seasons. Nuts, fruit, roots, meat, fish, seeds, eggs, greens. Settlement can narrow the table. Reliability replaces variety, and the body notices. Repetitive labor leaves marks. Grinding grain for hours changes the skeleton. Knees, hips, shoulders, arms, and spine carry the memory of repeated motion. Craft specialization can do the same. A person who strikes obsidian, weaves, carries loads, kneads, squats, climbs ladders, repairs plaster, or works at a hearth, repeats the same gestures again and again until bone responds. That is one of the quiet costs of civilization. The mobile body moves in variety. It climbs, runs, walks, digs, gathers, rests, carries, hunts, dances, shifts tasks. The settled body may work longer at fewer motions. Repetition feeds the group, but it also writes itself into joints. A grinding stone can become a lifelong companion, and, like some companions, it takes more than it admits. Then there are skull injuries. Some remains from Catal Hoyuk show healed fractures, suggesting that people suffered blows and survived them. The causes are debated. Interpersonal violence is possible. Accidents are possible. Falls from roofs are possible. In a city where people moved across rooftops every day, a fall could be serious. In a dense community where tempers had little distance to cool, conflict could also leave marks. We should be careful. A healed skull fracture is not a full story. It does not tell us whether someone was attacked, fell, was struck by accident, or lived through some ritual event we do not understand. But it tells us this much. The first city was not free from injury. Bodies were hit, cracked, healed, and carried on. That healing matters too. A person with a serious injury survived because others helped. They fed him. They watched him. They allowed time for bone to mend. The same crowding that created stress also made care possible. This is the double face of city life again. The city hurts and helps. It exposes and protects. It traps and supports. Life expectancy was not kind by modern standards. Many people died young. Children were vulnerable. Infection, childbirth, accidents, malnutrition, and labor all had claims on the body. Yet people endured. They built. They repaired. They carried babies up ladders. They laid the dead under floors. They painted walls. They sharpened obsidian. They hosted feasts. They made jokes over roof edges, because human beings can joke almost anywhere, even while their teeth are plotting rebellion. The question returns: why stay? If the teeth hurt, if the lungs suffered, if parasites moved quietly, if violence and accidents left marks, if food was monotonous and work was repetitive, why did people keep living this way? The answer is not one thing. Agriculture can trap a community. Once population grows around stored grain and cultivated fields, returning to full mobility becomes difficult. There are too many people for wild resources nearby. Old routes may be forgotten or occupied by others. Heavy tools and houses tie people to place. Animals require care. Fields require seasonal attention. Stored grain invites both security and dependency. The house itself traps gently. A wall repaired by your father. A floor under which your mother is buried. A platform where your children sleep. A roof path known by your feet in darkness. These are not chains made of iron. They are chains made of meaning. Sometimes those are stronger. Trade also mattered. Catal Hoyuk had access to obsidian and exchange networks. People may have stayed because the settlement offered goods, partners, craft, knowledge, marriage connections, ritual prestige, and protection through numbers. The household inside the city was part of a larger web. Leaving meant losing more than walls. It meant losing connections. Ritual held people too. A house with buried ancestors is not easy to abandon. A room with horns and paintings, rebuilt through generations, becomes more than property. It becomes a sacred continuity. If a family leaves, what happens to the dead below? What happens to the story of the house? What happens to the right to return? These questions are not abstract when the bones of your people lie under the platform where you sleep. Community itself was a lure. Humans need each other. A dense settlement gives help, news, marriage partners, shared feasts, skill exchange, protection, and identity. It gives a child many eyes and a sick person many hands. It gives loneliness less room, though it also gives irritation more room. The first city may have been crowded, smoky, unhealthy, and stressful, but it was also full of people. Sometimes people choose the crowded fire over the clean cold. That is still true. Catal Hoyuk may be one of the earliest versions of that bargain. A beautiful trap. The phrase is dark, but fair. Beautiful because it held art, memory, invention, ritual, craft, care, and shared identity. A trap because once people entered deeply, leaving became costly, perhaps impossible for many. And still, the house was repaired. Still, the hearth was lit. Still, a body was wrapped and placed beneath the floor. Still, someone smoothed plaster over the burial and went on with the evening meal. By night, the settlement would look peaceful from a distance. Smoke rising, roofs cooling, a few late figures crossing above the houses. the plain widening into darkness. Stars above, under the roofs, people sleeping near their tools, their children, their ancestors, their aches. Under the floors, older bones. Inside the bodies, infection, hunger, healing, memory, and endurance. Catal Hoyuk held both, the beautiful and the burden, the hearth and the cough, the ancestor and the abscess, the roof path and the fracture, the feast and the parasite. The city was not a mistake simply because it hurt. It was an experiment so powerful that even its costs became part of the future. The same density that spread disease also allowed skills to gather. The same storage that narrowed diet also fed larger populations. The same walls that trapped people also protected memory. That is why the story continues. After the bones, we must look at order. How did this place keep from tearing itself apart? How did thousands of people live without obvious kings, palaces, central temples, or streets? What kind of invisible law moved through rooftops, households, ancestors, and gossip? The answer is not simple, but it begins with the house. If the house was the heart of Catal Hoyuk, then order lived in the house. That is the strange answer the site keeps offering. Thousands of people lived close together, sometimes perhaps as many as 10,000, and yet archaeologists have not found a palace, not a royal tomb, not a separate grand temple, not a clear administrative building where a ruler sat above the rest. No wide avenue leads toward a throne room. No carved king looks down from stone. No written law code tells us who punished whom, because writing had not yet entered the settlement. And still, the place worked. Not for a season. Not for one brave generation. For more than 1,000 years, houses rose, fell, and rose again on the same mound. Roofs became roads. Burials remained under floors. Walls were replastered. Memories were held. Food was stored. Tools were exchanged. Children grew into adults who rebuilt the same rooms where they had once slept. That does not happen by accident. A dense settlement without order becomes noise, fear, and departure. Catal Hoyuk must have had rules, but the rules were not carved in royal stone. They were carried in custom, household memory, ritual obligation, gossip, shame, generosity, exchange, and the quiet pressure of being watched by everyone who lived 2 roofs away. Honestly, that may be more powerful than a palace. A palace can command from above. A neighbor can notice before breakfast. Imagine a morning on the rooftops. A woman climbs from her hatch and sees who has already lit the hearth. A child runs past, carrying something he should not be carrying. Someone on a nearby roof pauses long enough to remember it. A man visits a house that has been having disputes over storage. Another household fails to bring food to a gathering. A ladder is moved. A roof edge is repaired badly. A burial ritual is not performed as expected. None of these things vanish. They become talk. Talk becomes reputation. Reputation becomes law without a judge. In a place with no ground streets, Movement itself was visible. You crossed roofs in view of others. You entered houses from above. You carried baskets, tools, fuel, meat, grain, obsidian, pigment, and news across surfaces that belonged partly to households and partly to the community. Your path told a story about you before you opened your mouth. This kind of social order can be tender, and it can be cruel. It can help a widow because everyone knows she needs help. It can protect a child because many eyes see him near the edge. It can shame a greedy household because no one can hide a feast for long. It can also suffocate. It can make every mistake public. It can turn a small quarrel into a memory that follows a family for years. The first city may have been held together by care, but care and control often sleep under the same blanket. The house was the basic unit of this world. Not the individual, not the king, not the market, not the temple, but the house. A house held ancestors. A house held storage. A house held tools, stories, paintings, and claims to continuity. To belong to a house was to belong to a line that reached down through floors and backward through burials. The dead beneath the platform were not decoration. They were authority. Some houses seem to have had especially long histories. Archaeologists sometimes speak of history houses, places rebuilt again and again, with more elaborate burials, richer symbolism, or longer continuity. These may have been important houses, not palaces, not temples in a separate sense, but memory centers inside the ordinary fabric of the settlement. Authority may have belonged to households that could say, "Our dead are here. Our wall has stood here through many rebuildings. Our rights are known. Our feasts are remembered." That is a different kind of power. It does not need a crown. It needs continuity. A history house could anchor a lineage. It could hold ritual knowledge. It could host gatherings. It could remind others of obligations. It could become a place people entered with a different voice, softer perhaps, more careful. If power at Catal Hoyuk existed in such forms, then it was woven into domestic life rather than raised above it. This may explain why the settlement looks strangely equal from above. Many houses are similar in size and layout. Burials of men and women do not show a simple rigid hierarchy. Rich and poor differences exist, but they do not scream the way later class divisions do. There is no obvious ruler household with everything, and no obvious servant quarter with nothing. The differences are subtler, more hidden in history, ritual depth, access to exchange, and household reputation. The honest answer is that we do not fully know. That is not a failure. It is respect for the dead. We should not force them to wear modern desires like borrowed clothing. Catal Hoyuk was not a utopia. It was not a paradise of perfect equality. It was also not a small kingdom waiting for a king. It was its own thing. Demse, domestic, ritual, watchful, persistent, and strange. How did conflict work there? The bones suggest injuries. Some skulls show healed blows. Some people may have fallen from roofs. Some may have suffered violence. Crowding creates tension. Shared walls do not make all humans kind. A quarrel over food, access, marriage, ritual duty, or household reputation could become serious. But there is no strong evidence for organized warfare inside the settlement. The system seems to have absorbed conflict most of the time. Perhaps punishment was social. Access could be restricted. A ladder could be removed. A household could be shamed. Exchange partners could refuse cooperation. Feast invitations could stop. Gossip could become a wall more difficult to climb than mud brick. In a roof city, to be cut off from the network would be terrifying. You could still have a house, and yet feel the city withdraw from you. A palace punishes with guards. A household city punishes with absence. It is a very human kind of discipline. Now let the story turn toward another old settlement. Because Catal Hoyuk was not the only experiment. Jericho stands in the Jordan Valley, older in some ways, famous for its walls and its tower. It grew near a powerful spring, a source of water in a landscape where water could mean life, trade, defense, and sacred importance. Around 9,000 before the Common Era, people there built substantial stone walls and a massive tower, one of the earliest monumental structures known. If Catal Hoyuk feels like a honeycomb, Jericho feels like a statement. Stone wall, tower, spring, settlement gathered behind a hard boundary. The wall of Jericho has been interpreted in different ways. Defense is one possibility, though against whom and at what scale is debated. Flood control may have played a role. Social identity and collective labor likely mattered too. Whatever its exact purpose, the wall created a visible inside and outside with more force than the walls of individual houses. It said, "This settlement is a unit. This place is marked. This spring, this mound, this labor belong together." The tower is even more mysterious. It rises from the Neolithic world like a question made of stone. Was it defensive? Ritual. A marker of collective identity. A way to organize labor. A place linked to ancestors or celestial events. Scholars debate. The tower does not explain itself, which is inconsiderate of it. But ancient monuments have never been very polite about our curiosity. Think of building it. No metal tools, no machines. Stone carried, shaped, stacked. People coordinating effort across days and seasons. Someone decided where it would stand. Someone organized the labor. Someone persuaded others that the work mattered. Even without a king, monument building creates leadership, if only for the duration of the task. This makes Jericho feel different from Catal Hoyuk. At Catal Hoyuk, social life seems to spread horizontally through houses and roofs. At Jericho, walls and tower create a more centralized impression. Jericho seems more invested in boundary and monument, while Catal Hoyuk seems more invested in domestic continuity and roof-based density. Both are early answers to the same question. How do people stay together? Jericho says, gather around water, build a wall, raise a tower, make the settlement visible as one body. Catal Hoyuk says, press houses together, move across roofs, Bury ancestors under floors. Let households carry order. Neither answer is simple. Neither answer is primitive. They are experiments with human closeness, and both show that the road to civilization was not a single road. There were many possible futures. Some communities built walls. Some built roof worlds. Some emphasized monuments. Some emphasized houses. Some grew hierarchy more visibly. Some kept authority hidden in domestic memory. Humanity did not march in a straight line toward the city. It wandered into many versions of staying. This matters because the first city was not inevitable. It was chosen, adjusted, endured, repaired, and sometimes abandoned. In Catal Hoyuk, the choice was repeated every morning when someone climbed a ladder through a roof hatch. In Jericho, it was repeated when someone walked beside the wall or drew water from the spring under the tower's shadow. These were not abstract transformations. They were daily acts. Carry water. Patch plaster. Grind grain. Exchange tools. Bury the dead. Watch the neighbor. Guard the spring. Repair the wall. Civilization was built from repetition. The first builders did not know that their experiments would echo into Uruk, Memphis, Rome, London, Hanoi, and every crowded skyline where windows glow like modern hearths. They knew only their own problems. Too many people. Enough food if labor continued. Too much memory to leave. So they invented forms of togetherness. Some forms failed. Some lasted. Catal Hoyuk lasted a long time, but not forever. No experiment escapes time. By the later centuries, the settlement begins to show signs of strain. Houses change. Ritual intensity may fade. Sections empty. The old pattern of rebuilding weakens. The beautiful trap begins to loosen, or break, or become unnecessary. People who once stayed begin to consider leaving again. The roofs that served as streets grow quieter. The living are making different choices. Jericho and Catal Hoyuk remind us that the earliest cities were not endings. They were questions in mud brick and stone. How close can humans live? What holds us together without kings? What does a wall promise? What does a house remember? How much can people endure before the answer changes? The fire lowers. The roof city and the walled spring city stand for a moment in the dark, two different solutions under ancient stars. Then the wind shifts. The plaster begins to flake. The roofs empty, and Catal Hoyuk starts to leave itself behind. Catal Hoyuk did not end in one night. There was no single wall of flame that swallowed the roof city. No final army at the edge of the mound. No last king writing a desperate inscription, because there was no king there to write one. No dramatic gate closing, because the city had no gates in the way later cities would know them. The end came more quietly, and perhaps more humanly. A house went unrepaired. Then another. A roof path grew less busy. A painting faded and was not renewed. A family left. Then another family followed, carrying tools, seeds, baskets, memories, perhaps the skull of an ancestor, perhaps only the story of where that ancestor lay. The old mound did not collapse. It emptied by degrees. The first great roof city slowly became a place where the living no longer returned often enough to keep the walls alive. By around 5,700, Catal Hoyuk was losing the force that had held it together for so long. The signs are quiet, but they gather. Some later houses seem less carefully made. Some areas were abandoned. The dense rebuilding that had once raised the mound, layer by layer, began to weaken. Ritual intensity may have shifted. The great paintings and elaborate installations became less frequent. The long continuity of certain houses thinned. The settlement did not vanish because one simple cause struck it from outside. It appears to have suffered the slow convergence of many pressures. That is how many human worlds end. Not from one wound, from many smaller cuts that the body can no longer heal. The environment may have grown tired first. A large settlement needs fuel. It needs timber for building, reeds for matting, dung, brush, and anything that will burn. It needs fields nearby, and those fields need soil that can keep giving. It needs water that can be trusted. It needs animals, wild or managed, to remain within reach. Over centuries, thousands of people draw from the same landscape. They cut trees. They gather fuel. They graze animals. They farm soil. They dump waste. They reshape the living skin around the settlement. Deforestation likely mattered. The nearby woodland thinned. Timber became harder to obtain. Fuel may have shifted more toward dung and scrub. When trees vanish, water changes too. Soil erodes. Floods become harsher in some seasons. Streams become less reliable in others. The landscape around a settlement can begin to answer back, not with anger, but with exhaustion. The soil may have grown less generous. Fields used again and again ask for rest, but hungry people do not always have the luxury of letting earth sleep. Seeds become smaller. Yields decline. More labor brings less food. That is a frightening equation. A family can work harder and still eat less. A settlement can become more disciplined and still become weaker. Grain, once the promise of staying, becomes part of the strain. The same storage bins that made the future feel secure could also reveal the future shrinking. Gain, less grain in the bin, smaller seed heads, more effort, more worry. The grinding stone still waits each morning, but what it receives is thinner. A child asking for food does not care about soil exhaustion. Hunger is immediate. Explanation comes later. Water stress may have joined the trouble. Rivers and streams shift. Wetlands change. Rainfall patterns alter. Deforestation can make both flood and drought worse. The early city needed a delicate balance between human effort and local ecology. For a long time, that balance held. Then perhaps it did not. Trade, disease, and social strain may have joined the trouble. Obsidian roots may have shifted. Sickness may have pressed harder when nutrition weakened. Inequality may have grown more visible. No single cause needs to win. The city could have declined because many things leaned at once. Better opportunities elsewhere mattered too. People do not always leave because a place becomes impossible. Sometimes they leave because another place becomes possible. A family hears of better soil, wider pasture, cleaner water, useful trade, relatives who have settled elsewhere, a less crowded mound, a new way of living that does not require climbing over neighbors every morning. The old home is loved, but love does not always keep people where children are hungry. Leaving would not have been simple. Imagine a household preparing. The roof is familiar underfoot. The ladder has known every member of the family. The hearth has cooked meals through seasons of joy and quarrel. Under the platform are bones. Perhaps the house has been rebuilt many times, each new floor sealing older lives beneath it. To leave such a house is not like leaving a tent. It is leaving a layered memory. What do you take? A grinding stone is heavy. A storage bin cannot be carried. A wall painting stays. The ancestor under the floor may stay, unless a skull or bone has been removed for keeping. Tools can be wrapped. Seeds can be carried. Obsidian blades can travel. Stories must travel in the mouth. So the family gathers what it can. A basket of grain. A bundle of tools. A figurine, perhaps. A memory of where the dead remain. A child looks back and sees the roofline of home growing smaller. The adults do not explain everything. Adults rarely can. They say there is better land ahead. They say relatives wait. They say the old house will remember. One family leaves. Then another. The system weakens. A roof city depends on density. It needs many hands to repair surfaces, maintain paths, host feasts, preserve rituals, exchange food, and keep social pressure alive. Empty houses are not neutral. They become gaps in the web. A roof path that passes over abandoned rooms feels less safe. A house without smoke changes the mood of the houses beside it. Silence spreads. Eventually, Catal Hoyuk was no longer the first great experiment of staying. It became an archaeological mound waiting for rediscovery. Dust entered rooms. Plaster flaked. Painted animals faded. Bull horns remained in walls, but no firelight moved their shadows. The dead beneath floors stayed where they had been placed, patient in the darkness. The roof streets disappeared into earth. That ending is melancholy, but not failure. This is important. Catal Hoyuk did not need to last forever in order to matter. A human experiment can end and still change everything. The people who left did not leave empty-handed. They carried knowledge. How to build densely. How to store food. How to bury ancestors under homes. How to organize households. How to manage exchange. How to live with crowding. How to repair walls. How to make ritual from daily rooms. How to endure and how not to endure. Urban knowledge spreads like seeds. Not cleanly, not in one neat line, but outward, through families, marriages, trade, migration, imitation, and memory. Some ideas survive. Some are abandoned. Some return in new forms. Later settlements across Anatolia and the Near East would solve the problem differently. Then, much later, true cities with temples, writing, kings, walls, markets, workshops, records, armies, and streets would rise in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and beyond. Those later cities were not copies of Catal Hoyuk, but they inherited the question: how do humans live together at scale? How do we share walls without destroying one another? How do we store food without creating inequality? How do we honor the dead without being trapped by them? How do we use the land without exhausting it? How do we make belonging without making prison? That question is still ours. Look at a modern apartment building at night. Windows glowing. Someone above walking too heavily. Someone below trying to sleep. Elevators instead of ladders. Concrete instead of mud brick. Electric light instead of hearth glow. But the old problem remains. We live close because closeness gives us power. We suffer because closeness has a price. Catal Hoyuk is still under our feet in that sense. Under the idea that more people together can make something no one household can make alone. And under the bargain we keep making between freedom and belonging. The first builders traded movement for memory. We are still paying and still receiving. There is no need to romanticize the old wanderers or the first settlers. Mobile hunter-gatherer life had hardship, danger, loss, and violence too. Early city life had care, beauty, ritual, art, and community too. The choice was not between heaven and misery. It was between different forms of risk. Humans tried one form for a very long time, then tried another. And the second form grew so powerful that it became the shape of the modern world. The first city nearly destroyed those who lived inside it because it asked bodies to eat too much grain, breathe too much smoke, live too close, repeat too many motions, and depend too heavily on one place. But it also gave them a hearth that waited, a roof path known in darkness, ancestors beneath the floor, neighbors who helped more than they admitted, work shared across households, ritual painted on walls, and a sense that the living and the dead belonged to one place. That is why they stayed, at least for a while. Now, in the imagination, let us return one last time to the mound at evening. The modern fields are quiet. The excavation trenches are covered or protected. The wind moves over the place where roofs once made streets. Hassan Dag sits far away, its volcanic slopes remembering the black glass that traveled through human hands. Beneath the soil are houses on houses, floors on floors, burials on burials. The old city folded into itself. No smoke rises now. No ladder creaks. No child runs across a roof. No neighbor complains about heavy footsteps overhead. But the question remains alive. Why did humans build the first city if it nearly destroyed them? Because staying solved problems movement could not solve. Because movement solved problems staying could not solve. Because humans are creatures of need and memory, always trading one danger for another. Because a house can become a heart. Because a wall can become a promise. Because a crowd can become a burden. Then a community. Then a world. The fire is low now. The room is warm. The first city can sleep again under dust and grass. Let the roofs grow quiet. Let the hearths cool. Let the bullhorns hold their shadows. Let the ancestors rest under the floors. Let Jericho keep its spring and tower in the pale dawn. Let Catal Hoyuk remain what it was, not a failure, not a paradise, but an unfinished experiment whose questions still walk through every modern street. And as the night deepens, remember this gently. Every city light is an old hearth. Every apartment wall is a descendant of mud brick. Every crowded street is a roof path in another form. Every home is still asking the first question. Do we stay? Good night.